Hello, and welcome to this talk on inclusion. As general education teachers, you've probably heard the word inclusion, but today we're going to talk more about what that means, the background on it, some of the current research and practices, and hopefully as general ed teachers, you can start thinking about what it means for you to bring inclusion to your classroom or your school and what kinds of strategies you need to use, what challenges you might face, and get a sense of what inclusion really means. So I want to start by thinking a little bit about what comes to mind when you think of adding special education to your classroom. And if you just take a second and think about what challenges pop up in your head, you might be thinking about, just the fear of working with a population that you don't know as well. Special education is its own discipline, so it's something that takes skill and knowledge. So I know there's often a fear of working with special education students. In terms of time, teachers are already strapped for time, so having to accommodate students who have special needs may create a fear of not having enough time. And additionally, resources, not knowing what you need to work with these students, not having the tools to adequately change your curriculum or your classroom structure to work with them, and not knowing what to do to make that happen. So just a general kind of deficit in terms of what we need to work with those students is often what comes up when general education teachers think about working with a special needs population. I often find it helpful to use storytelling as a way to think about some of these larger issues that teachers face. So I just wanted to start with a quick story about a woman named Temple Grandin. Temple was born autistic at a time when autistic folks were more often institutionalized than educated. They were thought as, ineducable. But her mother refused to let that happen and made sure she received an education. So Temple used her understanding of her own autism in a really amazing way and connected it to animal behaviors. She spent a summer on her family's cattle farm and noticed that a lot of their behaviors mimicked her behaviors with autism, which is a really amazing ability in self-awareness. So she understood that her own motivation by fear was very similar to animals' motivations, especially prey animals like cattle. And using her own understanding of herself, she grew to be one of the most influential animal behavior specialists of her time, and influenced of the field of both animal behavior and the beef industry remarkably. So even if students in the special education realm are not as brilliant as Temple was or as self-aware, she's sort of an exceptional example. I think this is a great example of how all students with disabilities deserve the opportunity to succeed and to see where their knowledge and abilities can take them. So this segues into the idea of inclusion as really valuing what a student has instead of seeing what they are lacking. So in Temple's case, this is seeing the intelligence and self-awareness she has rather than her lack of social skills. One of the difficult parts about being a general education teacher, I think, is that you kind of live in between, the administrators who are kind of thinking theoretically and big picture about things and the on-the-ground work. You have to take what people see in terms of big picture and make that on-the-ground work happen. So often we hear words like inclusion, very jargony words, and sometimes it's frustrating to not just have a basic definition, like what are we talking about when we mean inclusion? So to start, I wanted to kind of give that background. So inclusion essentially means including students with special needs in the general education classroom rather than excluding them from general education. This does not mean they don't receive the services they need at all. It's meant that you bring the special needs services to them while they're in the general education classroom. That can look a couple different ways, which we'll take a look at more in depth in a minute here in this presentation. Another focus is the learning that they're capable of and measuring that. So what can the student do and are they able to learn that rather than their rate of learning? Are they learning, X, Y, and Z in a certain amount of time, but instead focusing on what they're capable of and whether they're reaching that. And we can compare this to mainstreaming. which is when a student is in a special education program and is just dropped into general ed programs like phys ed or art. So inclusion is different than that. Inclusion is they're in the general education setting, and we bring the services to them. So you might be thinking, as a general education teacher, oh, so now all students have to come to me instead of, being offloading some of that burden onto the special needs teachers. And that's not necessarily what we're talking about. Inclusion is very student focused. So it's based a lot on individual evaluations to determine what that student needs. And it's not always best for them to be in the general education classroom and receiving services dropped in that way. It may be best for them to be pulled out into an individual program or even put in an institutional program separate from both home and school. So there's a continuum of placements that can range from them being in the general education classroom and receiving services with special ed support to having instruction done in an institution or in the home. So it's not a certain place when we're talking about inclusion. There's no place where that's happening. Similar to the IEP, it's very based on your individual student needs and assessments. So before going a little more in depth about the strategies and ways we can make inclusion happen, I wanted to take a step back and talk about the history of special education that has led us to thinking about inclusion. As you may know, special education has a pretty brutal history that is based around exclusion and segregation. In our history, many students have not received the education they honestly deserve or capable of because of our misunderstandings of students with special needs. In the early 1970s, we had 1 million children with disabilities completely excluded from public education and deemed ineducable, and 3.5 million not receiving the appropriate services if they were receiving services. And by 1975, we had the Education for All Children Act, which allowed students with disabilities to get a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment possible. So inclusion is kind of a way to continue thinking about the least restrictive environment possible. Some people believe it's even just a step in the right direction and is not the end goal, where the end goal is complete inclusion. But either way, no matter your belief about whether it's the end goal or just a step in the right direction, many more students are receiving the appropriate education that they need. Thinking a little bit about what inclusion has to offer students and why we should even consider this as a path in education. Inclusion is a lot about finding different adaptations for curriculum and different strategies that certain students need to succeed. And this is likely to benefit all students, not just those with disabilities. Classrooms, as you all know better than anyone, are increasingly made up of a diversity of student populations with different needs and experiences, and more and more students are coming in with certain disabilities or learning disabilities. So in addition to that, in studies where we have seen students express their opinions about inclusion strategies, those students overwhelmingly throughout all ages and grades prefer teachers who are willing to make adaptations to their needs. The one exception we've seen is in terms of tests and homework, when certain students have tests or homework that is different because of their disability or different because of their needs, and then they can't collaborate with their peers. That's the one time we sort of see students not preferring inclusion, but otherwise it is overwhelmingly preferred. Beyond just students preferring inclusion methods, of course, we want to do things that students prefer and excited about. That's always a good goal. But another important goal is their academic performance. So inclusion in schools that are using inclusion practices, academic performance is also increasing. Grades increase and test scores. And in addition, students take on role model and leadership roles in inclusion settings. So those students who may be learning at a faster pace than other students are able to take on a leadership role and potentially explain things in a way that maybe a teacher can't even explain something to a student with different needs. So you're giving students those opportunities to succeed. that in ways they may not otherwise, particularly looking at students in underrepresented groups, such as students of color, students of low income, who are disproportionately placed in special education classrooms. Under inclusion, those students are receiving more of an appropriate and successful education. As with most developments in education, there are definitely concerns to consider for teachers, and I don't want to suggest that inclusion is the end all be all and the solution to all of our problems without seriously considering the concerns that a teacher may have and situations you might face and problems you might face trying to work in an inclusion model. So, as again, you all know better than anyone, teaching is hard enough as it is. Teachers are increasingly losing time with students, losing planning time, asked to do more with the same amount of time. So, we are strapped for time already, and thinking about changing our strategies and introducing new strategies is always a concern to consider. And what kind of burden is this placing on our teachers, and how can we ease that burden by bringing in the appropriate supports? So that's always something to be thinking about. Beyond that, there is the reality of teaching students with things like an emotional behavioral disorder or learning disabilities. Students with emotional behavioral disorders can change a classroom climate and dynamic. Those students tend to do better when they're in a group of other students with EBD because they don't feel so different and weird. They don't tend to act out as much. But when they're placed in general education classrooms and they see other students behaving in a certain way, sometimes they feel different and it causes them to act out. And students respond to each other, both special needs and not. So the students in your general ed classroom may be negatively affected by those students' presence as well. And it's important to weigh the pros and cons of that situation. Students with learning disabilities, in addition, can be successful under the inclusion model. There are studies that show they still improve academically, but they don't improve quite as much as they would if they were to receive those very specific services through special education. So it's worth thinking about, how much are my students with learning disabilities suffering in order to make a more inclusive model. So it's definitely important to consider the specific needs of those groups of students with those disabilities. So now that we've gotten a solid basis of, what is inclusion and a definition and understanding, and looked at some pros and cons, I want to start thinking through how you can bring inclusion into a school and what does it actually look like. So there are sort of three main models you can try to establish at your school, both involving work between a general education teacher and a special education teacher. So as I pointed out earlier, this is not just general education teachers taking on special education without that knowledge. It's the collaboration of the two that's really crucial. So in the first model, you have co-planning between the general and special education teachers, so that you need time in a day where you're sitting down and talking through what strategies and methods would be best for your students. So you're planning together. Under the second model, you have consultation and collaboration between general and special education teachers. So the general education teacher is coming in and saying, I have these X, Y, and Z problems. What do we need to do to address these problems? And maybe the special education teacher is coming in occasionally to assist in the classroom. And under the third model is co-teaching between the two teachers. So you're splitting your time in a classroom where both are doing some of the teaching. And that obviously also involves some co-planning as well. So that's sort of the most intensive model possible. And to me, perhaps the most appealing as someone who really likes co-teaching. And I think that all three models really give the general education teacher a lot of support if done well. So those are the models under which inclusion can work, but how do we actually make this work? What are the strategies teachers can use in the classroom? After talking with teachers, some of the most feasible and doable strategies are things that honestly really benefit the whole classroom and the whole school environment. Things like establishing a personal relationship with students with disabilities, to understand, that creates a pathway for communication where they can tell you what they need and you can make those adjustments. Um, Practicing reinforcement and encouragement when they're doing things well, or even when they're not doing things well. How can you help them feel like they're supported and you want them to succeed? So it's a lot of both verbal and written encouragement. And, you can be creative about how you do that. And then finally, integrating students with disabilities into those whole class activities wherever possible. You don't want to do something that will make them uncomfortable, but there's often times where they can just be involved in a whole class activity, and don't need to be separated. And finding when those moments are possible is really important. As a teacher, I know I would be thinking at this point, but really, what do I actually do in my classroom? So I wanted to give just some more concrete examples of ways you can use strategies that are useful in an inclusion model. So some general strategies are things like check-ins. And again, these are things that you may already be doing and that are really good for all student populations, but are particularly useful in the inclusion model. So check-ins are just really informal, quick. Maybe at the end of a lesson, you have everyone close their eyes and give a thumbs up, thumbs down, or thumbs middle for their understanding. Or I've heard of teachers who have said, close your eyes, raise your hand if you're totally confused right now or totally get it. So just a quick check-in. Other useful strategies are having students summarize the main points so you can see where their level of understanding is, what they took away, what they're still missing. And even summarizing directions is really helpful, especially in like lab classrooms where you're doing a complex lab or activity and group work. Asking a couple of students to just repeat back to you what they're supposed to do can be a really helpful strategy. Learning logs where students just kind of write down what they took away from a lesson, what they're still wondering. Those are really great ways to record what your students are taking away from lessons. The ever reliable think, pair, share, where you have students think on their own for a couple minutes. You ask a question, have them think on their own, find a partner and share what they're thinking. And then you share as a group, have a couple people share out. And that's a way you can get students who are uncomfortable sharing in front of their whole class, really comfortable sharing with like one person. In that setting, you as the teacher can walk around and hear what everyone's saying, even if they don't share out to the big group at the end. It's a great way to check in with everyone and get them interacting with other students. The KWL chart is always a great tool. It's something you do in terms of a lesson or activity where you ask what they know about a topic, what they want to know. So that's sort of at the beginning, and then what they learned at the end. So you can use that throughout a lesson as well. In terms of engaging with the textbooks in class and how to use an inclusion model with textbooks, one way to make readings more accessible is to simplify and supplement the readings. So for students of different ability levels, you might give them a smaller piece of the reading to do and shorter, or just highlight the areas that are most important to them, or find readings that will kind of enhance their understanding, readings that maybe use different language or are shorter or more accessible in whatever way, because textbooks are written for more of a general audience. And don't always account for those special needs. And you can also structure reading assignments in a way that make them more accessible. So instead of just assigning chapter 1 for reading, you can do things like provide like a study guide. Those are really popular and often are made by textbook companies now, where students are sort of finding information as they go and filling out the study guide to make sure they're taking away those main points and main ideas. Or, maybe you have them read a small section and the next day in class, you go over a vocabulary and what they took away. That may be more time consuming, but might help those students who really need the reading more broken down. Or you provide a vocabulary worksheet, just anything that will scaffold the learning so that they're making sure the students are checking in as they're going to make sure they understand. For multi-level approaches and strategies, I will preface this by saying I'm just going to give sort of a brief overview, but if you are serious about using any of these strategies, I think it's worth looking more in depth into exactly how to structure them, because a lot of them, like peer tutoring, are most effective with a very specific structure and strategy. So I think they're worth looking more in depth into. But just to give an overview, peer tutoring, as a huge bonus, is really preferred by a lot of students. They enjoy it. So you're pairing students in groups, usually of students with a higher ability and lower ability level, and they're working together in groups and helping each other where they're confused. And that benefits the student with the disability or the lower learning level, as well as the student with the higher learning level, because by reading back or describing information, they're also solidifying their learning. Collaborative learning is where, again, you're pairing students of different ability levels, and you're having them work in usually smaller groups. The small groups lend themselves really well to students working really closely together. And you have students working in those groups to complete an activity or some kind of task. So now that we've thought a little bit about the models and the strategies that can be used in the classroom in an inclusion model, I just want to reiterate that none of this is possible without full support of the teacher and the special education teachers carrying out this work. So support from administration, from the district, is really crucial to a successful inclusion model. And while inclusion is not required by law at this point, as you all know from a student IEP, placing them in the least restrictive environment is required by law. So I just wanted to go over what options are available at this point for students with special needs, and what that looks like. So under level 1, you have a general ed classroom with a special education specialist coming in and consulting with the general ed teacher, giving them full support in the classroom through consultation. Level 2 is where you have a general ed classroom teacher who's working on cooperative teaching or co-teaching with a special ed teacher. So they're sharing responsibilities in the classroom. Under level 3, and this is what a lot of school districts look like, you have a student who's in the general education classroom for part of the day and a special ed classroom for the other part of the day. They often drop in to general ed classrooms for phys ed or art, but the number of hours a day that a special needs student will spend in general education is based on the severity of their disability and those, individual evaluations, again, that are really important. Under level 4, and again, a lot of schools look like this as well, especially I'm at a school that is the county seat, the big city in a rural area. So a lot of services are at the school. And they have a full-time special ed classroom within the general education school. And students will spend all of their time there, occasionally dropping into phys ed or cooking, home ec, those kind of classes. Level 5 is when a student spends their whole day at a special education school and receives full support there from special education professionals. And level 6 is either a residential treatment or home treatment center. So that is the range of possibilities for a student with disabilities. I know I find concrete examples really helpful and sometimes hopeful as well. So just to give a case study, Flamingo Elementary School is a school made up of mini schools, so smaller schools within the school. And one of those mini schools, the Pioneers, was designated as an inclusive school. So in that mini school, they had 2 special education teachers assigned to every 3 general education teachers. So a really high ratio of special ed to general ed teachers. And those teachers were given plenty of time each day for co-teaching and co-planning. Multiple hours where each are teaching and then time each day to plan together. So a lot of support in that way. And the school also had a special education teacher who served as a resource where he or she was needed. to drop in and help. So this is just an example of what inclusion models can look like in a school, and how much time and support you need to make it happen and to make inclusion happen in a responsible way. But it is possible. So just as a couple concluding thoughts, I want to say that, inclusion, while it sounds difficult and resource heavy, I think is also a model of social justice. It's a model where we think about what the student needs and deserves in terms of their education, and less about, our restrictive school environments and what we're able to provide. We think more about what the student deserves. And I think to advocate for an inclusion model is to advocate for a student's rights. And it's really important in that way. I also want to end by acknowledging the importance of teacher advocacy as general education teachers who may be asked to work in an inclusion model or work in a school trying to implement inclusion. I think it's really important that teachers are advocates for their own needs. And I think the only way inclusion can work in a successful and responsible way is for teachers to kind of voice their needs and their limits and express when they need support, because I think that will make sure that teachers aren't burnt out or asked to stretch themselves too thin for the sake of the students, because a true social justice model thinks about the needs of both the teachers and the students and really everyone involved. So I think it's important to consider those things when thinking about this model. So thank you all for listening to this presentation on a really important topic in education. I hope you learned a thing or two that feels useful to your classroom or your profession. And yeah, below is a list of resources I used, although there are plenty more resources out there. These are just the main ones I relied on. But I'm sure if you have any questions, there's a resource that likely addresses that question. So yeah, thank you.